Hello and welcome to yet another edition of these interviews that we've been doing with independent publishers and independent media. Today we have with us Nandini Dhar. She is one of the editors of a very interesting bilingual journal cum publishing house as well called Aainanagar. Thank you very much, Nandini Dhi, for your
Thanks,
time.
Shuradeep, for inviting me.
Could you tell us how did Aainanagar start and why did you think that it was essential to have it as a bilingual journal with content in Bangla as well as English?
Right. So Aainanagar started in a very informal kind of a way. So Madhusri and I, we had been friends. Madhusri is the other editor, so Madhusri Bosu. So we had been friends for a long time. And also during the entire kind of 90s, we were both very young then. I was fairly young and Madhusri was literally a high school girl. We were working with, and oftentimes not in very disciplined ways, with another little magazine called Apor in Bangla, in Kolkata. And after a few years, it kind of literally died, right, in the way a lot of the little magazines go through their natural deaths. So there weren't enough people who could put in that time. The one editor who was really taking a lot of the initiatives, he just couldn't have the energy anymore. So basically there was this kind of need we felt just in a very personal, individualized kind of a way that we need to do something. And it was also exactly during the time that I had finished my PhD and got my first job. So I had that little bit of money, right? So the little bit of money that we could use to set up the website, to have a couple of projects going on. And so that was it. It wasn't something we had planned very carefully. It wasn't something about which we had lots of preparatory conversations, lots of organizing efforts. But it was really something we both felt that we needed to do. We needed to carry on the conversation. We both liked to write. We both thought that lots of things were happening in the world about which we needed to comment upon. And in terms of its being bilingual, I think we were both really invested in Bangla, in developing Bangla, and since both of our own growth as writers, and I think also as critics, happen within the space of the kind of the Bangla literary magazines, right, and especially little magazines, it was a natural choice for us. I think what was a more conscious choice was to kind of make it bilingual and to include English. And part of it was that we recognized that, whether we like it or not, and sometimes I personally don't like it as much, the extent to which in India and globally too, our conversations are dominated by English, right? But it's an imperative. We cannot avoid English at this point. A lot of innovative work has happened in India in English, in the subcontinent in English. And English is, and again, whether we like it or not, for better or for worse, it is the language of communication between, say, Bengal and the rest of India, India and the rest of the subcontinent and the rest of the world. So it didn't really seem it would be a wise choice, right, to actually exclude English. But also the fact that we were both living outside of Kolkata, outside of Bengal, so there was also the need for us to kind of continue these conversations with the friends we were making, and I was living out of the country, right? So with the kind of the new friends and the new contacts we're developing in the spaces we're living. And so that's why it's kind of bilingual.
Interestingly, there's one point that I'd like to bring up. The little magazine movement, as you said, has its like spurts and sometimes it grows and then there's stop and then it begins again. Why do you still call it a little magazine? You also do this archival project of archiving other little magazines, which I would say, well, if we think of little magazine as a genre, those are really little magazines, but yours is something which is a little beyond Bengal or that local space. It does have sort of a globalized, like it aims to be rooted in a certain place, but at the same time looks at the world from a larger perspective. So why do you still call it a little magazine, and could you tell us a little bit about that other project of actually archiving Bangla little magazines in your website?
I would personally say that the little magazine, like most other things, it's not a homogeneous project. It never has been, right? And also we can see historically in Bengali. If we look into the history of the little magazines, there are magazines right now which started off as little magazines, but right now you cannot really categorize them as little magazines as such. The sheer volume, right? So kind of the sheer question of size, if we think of the word little as saying something in terms of the smallness of the actual magazine we can hold in our hands, a lot of the kind of the canonical little magazines, and the little magazines, I would say, as a formation, it has its own canon right now. A lot of the journals are not little by any means, but at the same time, the reason why we insist on that term, there are a couple of reasons. One is, I think that historically little magazines, and especially within the Bengali and other regional languages, and maybe also outside of India, they have oftentimes been extremely operative in bringing out literary works and oftentimes also visual art, which could not have been accommodated within the more institutional forms of writing and art making. And I'm not saying that in a way it's about that, okay, because say A, B and C, kind of these big institutions are not going to publish my work, I'm going to do that in a little magazine, although it can also be a way of working, but it is to say that there are kind of historical moments when certain forms of arts are being produced, which cannot, by the sheer nature of their constitution, can be accommodated in this institutional art, right? So little magazines have made spaces for them. But so that's also why we keep on insisting the term, because of its history, but also that's what we would like to do. And we haven't been very successful because of, a lot of the kind of, I think the world has changed a lot in the last 50 years. But I think that what we still insist on doing is to develop a writing culture, a magazine making culture, an art making culture, which is not dependent upon forms of institutional funding, forms of kind of international funding, and also we are not necessarily interested in patronizing art that can easily find spaces within the more corporate, more established ways of funding. So that would be the kind of two reasons. And if you ask me in specific questions about the archiving, I can talk towards that too.
Because of the fact that it's a problem really for someone who is not aware of the little magazine scene very, very closely. It's really very hard to find, even a Bengali speaker will find it hard to locate one particular little magazine unless it's sort of become something big and is no longer a little magazine, say Desh or some other magazines I have in mind. So why did you think that it was essential to actually start this archival project?
Partly because of the kind of the practical aspects, right? That so many of the little magazines have been lost. It's difficult to find them, and lots of important work are being done. And by important, I don't necessarily mean important in terms of the kind of the academic notions of, say, competence, right? Or the more institutional notions of what is good writing and what is not. Something can be extremely important, say, for a specific locality, for a specific group of people. So to kind of have some kind of archival preservation, a history of that, living footprints, right? The kind of the trace marks, so to say. But also, as someone who also engages a little bit, has to professionally with literary criticism, I think precisely because of the nature, its own nature, it's extremely difficult to historicize little magazines or the literature that has been written or have found it's with their primary voices, the kinds of writing within the little magazines. So there is, I think, that a clear desire on our part to preserve that history as much as we can, and oftentimes we cannot do it very well. We definitely have not done it in a systematic form because of issues of kind of access and our own kind of precarious lives. But it's precisely to kind of have a space to have an archive, and also digital archive makes it more affordable, more accessible, and just to kind of have a broader audience who can know about the value of the work that's being done outside of the institutional journals.
Sure. With respect to the point that you made about the institutional forms of art and art which may be outside of that, outside of those forms. I have it with me, and I'd like to show this to the viewers. Aainanagar, along with another poetry journal, Vayavya, which is run by a very young but a fairly experienced, I should say, editor, Mihir Vats now. And they've come up with these really amazing small chapbooks. So, and it's in a set of 5 designed, printed, edited, everything done by this group of 5 to 7 people. Nandini, why was it important to, like, why did you feel the need to come out into, say, book publishing, apart from being, like, say, an online journal? And I know that you have also published books in Bangla prior to this, a lot of other books actually, on, say, and why, how do you select the content of the books? I mean, even if we leave this project aside and talk about it for some time, but also the other books that you've published, say, on, I think there's one on labor laws in Bangla, say, it's a very kind of introductory reader on labor laws in Bangla. What drives the kind of content that you will publish from your
Yeah, I mean, for us, book is a very different kind of a form than a journal, right? So, and it also seemed that once we have been working as journal editors in journal publishing for a while, the logical conclusion is to walk into the terrain of book publishing. So in terms of the Bangla publishing, we began with the poetry projects of our very close friends. So people we know had been working on their poems for a long time. They had been poets on their own rights for a long time, but other than maybe 20 or 50 of their friends, depending, the number really depending on how you look into it, never really knew of them as poets. So to kind of get their books to our audience, right? So, and I think by that time, we could say that we didn't have a huge audience, but the work we had done with journal publishing had actually given us a small number of audience. So basically, it's again the continuation of the work that we want to do ideally, and oftentimes we haven't been able to do it very well in the last 4 or 5 years as this kind of the work that we think little magazines do. It's kind of logical conclusion. In terms of the kind of the other 2 books, non-fiction we have done, the one on labor law, and as you said, it's a very introductory kind of, it's a really a kind of a chapbook on labor law. And this is something we are increasingly feeling, right, with the political climate and everything, that there is a need for a lot of these introductory kinds of books, and not just on labor laws, but on many, many different kinds of, as many issues we can think of. And I don't think it's a work we can do alone, but there is a need for all of us who do believe in some kind of independent publishing to come up and do like 50 to 60 pages, not something that's as complex as academic writing, but also not diluting the content as such, right? So to basically have a conversation in terms of kind of the basic history, right? So what is a labor law? I mean, if we think of labor law as such, oftentimes the relationship of workers to the labor law is one of a distance, it's one of fear. And this is a book we actually have sold in the factory gates. We have actually shared it with a lot of our friends who are labor activists, and they have basically sold it for as low as kind of 5 rupees, right, to a lot of the kind of the workers they're working with. So to kind of and defamiliarize, if you will, the very idea of labor law as something that the workers should be afraid of, should be intimidated by, but instead, without getting into the complexities which legal language often can assume, to actually educate and to kind of get to the average worker who is literate in Bengali, the reality of the labor law. And if you read the book, you would find that couple of places it's getting to the point, it's not getting into the complexities, but that was not our goal. That was also not the goal of the writer, the economist Shubhendu Dasgupta, who was working with us on this. But it was this idea that we get to the workers, to the average worker who is literate in Bengali, to the basics of labor law, that what is labor law all about. The other book we have done, it's a slightly longer and slightly more complicated piece on nationalism and Rabindranath. It's written by the poet Sabyasachi Deb. And that too, when we really felt that nationalism is something that needs to be addressed right now. And obviously Rabindranath, I mean, on the one hand, he's such an iconic figure in Bengal. It's very difficult to do a really critical work on Rabindranath, but on the other hand, if we think of the recent right-wing attack on Rabindranath and his views on nationalism, so it seemed like a really important project to think of the question of nationalism as such, to think of re-evaluating Rabindranath as such, and to bring the two together. So that had been, and also, I mean, I would say that we are interested in the issues of democratic movements. We are interested in the issues of developing a more democratic public space, public culture. And we would like to expand that to other languages, but we are also fairly restricted in terms of the languages we know well and the kind of the spaces we can operate. So we are keeping ourselves limited to Bangla and English right now. But we are interested in working with the activists in terms of the kind of a more expansive notion of the public cultural space.
So do you see this poetry project as an extension maybe of that in some way, or do you see that as a separate sort of?
Yeah, I mean, I would say on the one hand, I mean, there is, I do see the work of public culture and building up a public space and its inherent notion of democracy. It extends to arts as well, right? So I would say that poetry historically has oftentimes played that role in India, elsewhere in the world. So on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, poetry is also a form in itself with its own complex history. So I don't think that the kind of public cultural work we do, the kind of public spaces we can build with poetry would always be exactly the same thing as the kind of the public culture we build up with our discussions on labor laws, for example, right? So there is a difference, but there is also a kind of complementarity. One cannot necessarily happen without the other.
Nandini, my last question, and this is something that I more or less ask to all the people that we've so far been able to interview in this series. What do you like to consider yourselves? What is mainstream media for you, or say mainstream publishing, media/publishing, media or alternative or independent? What do these terms resonate with you, and what would you call Aainanagar?
So, for me and for us, funding is an extremely important factor, right? So where the money comes from, and by that I don't necessarily mean the jobs we have, although those can also be important. I mean, we all need to work for someone, right? But by funding, I mean the structures through which kind of the more institutional structures through which art is often funded. So what we would like to do, and we have been able to, and we have no plans of changing it in the kind of the near future, to actually stay away from the funding agencies. We don't call ourselves an art NGO. We don't call ourselves an alternative media NGO. We believe in kind of basically putting in money in parts of our salaries into the work we are doing, and we are happy with that. That also means that we haven't been able to do as much as we want to, but then again, we recognize that limitation, but we are okay with it, and we don't really have the kind of the dreams of bigness, which oftentimes getting funding from agencies, institutional agencies, can lead us to. So I would say that where the funding comes from and the ability to stay away from either the governmental or the kind of the more international privatized sources of funding, that's an important aspect of staying independent. And I mean, I think that in some ways we can talk about the corporate media, right, which in a way the way it operates in the regional markets, especially in Bengal. There are important kind of resonances with that, with the kind of the English language media, but there are also kind of important disconnects. but without naming names, I would say that we want to stay away from the corporate media model, which also means that we are not as such quote unquote efficient as the corporate media, but then also we think that the notion of efficiency in media is also something that needs to be questioned a little bit. Like, what is efficiency? What actually allows us to be efficient in the way the model has been set up by the media, which is clearly being funded by the advertisements coming from the corporate houses. So to be able to operate without falling into that, while staying away from that, and to be able to operate in really personal, small ways. That's what I would describe as, and we would describe as, independent media.
Sure, I'm sure even though the ways are small, I'm sure the aim is much bigger than what maybe the corporate media aims or tries to do. But we hope all the best to Aainanagar, Nandinidhi, and thanks very much
for inviting me. Thanks for having me.
We hope that you keep seeing this series and keep following and subscribing to our YouTube channel. We have interviewed Vijay Prasad of Leftward Books. We've interviewed V. Geeta of Tara Books, which is based in Chennai, and we've also interviewed Thema, which is another sort of independent publishing house based in Calcutta. We've interviewed Shomik Bandyopadhyay and Sudeshna Banerjee as part of this series. Please make sure that you maybe look up those interviews as well. We will send the links to those in the description to this video, and subscribe to our channel. That's all we have for today. Thank you.